Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of With the British Army in the Holy Land by H. O. Locke. Chapter 3, Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, and the HEJAZ.
Having taken a hurried glance at the campaign in Sinai, which directly led up to that in Palestine, we will take a yet more hurried glance at three other campaigns in Asiatic Turkey which had their bearing, direct or indirect, upon the Palestine operations. Most important among these was the expedition to Mesopotamia. In 1914, when Turkey came into the war against us, a British Indian brigade was landed at the mouth of the Shatt al-Arab, the common estuary by which the Tigris and the Euphrates reach the Persian Gulf. The objects of this expedition were to secure the oil fields of Persia, in which Britain was largely interested, to neutralize German ascendancy, which was rapidly developing in this part of the world through her interests in the Baghdad Railway, and to embarrass Turkey by attacking her at a point where facilities of maneuver and supply seemed to hold out a reasonable promise of success. Throughout 1915, this expedition met with uninterrupted success. The British Indian forces engaged were increased in number and strength, and in spite of appalling conditions of climate, and notwithstanding more than one narrow escape from disaster, the British flag was pushed further and further forward into this flat, alluvial country. In the autumn of 1915, we held all the country up to Nasiriyah on the Euphrates and to Kut el Amara on the Tigris. Then that ill-fated decision was arrived at, which sent General Townshend, with the inadequate force at his command, up the Tigris to capture Baghdad. This force went heroically forward, and just short of that city, defeated the Turks at the Battle of Ctesiphon. But General Townshend's casualties were heavy, and his available reinforcements were neither sufficiently numerous nor at hand. The pick of the Turkish army, released by our withdrawal from Gallipoli, had poured down to reinforce the enemy, and General Townshend had no alternative but to beat a hasty retreat. Accordingly, he fell back to Kut el Amara. Partly from inability to get his war-worn forces further away, and partly from a disinclination to abandon this important tactical point to the enemy, he consolidated here and prepared to withstand a siege. The history of that siege will live as one of the noblest in the annals of the British Army. But the stars in their courses fought against us. Strong enemy positions, inadequate supplies and transport arrangements, floods, and appalling conditions of country and weather proved overwhelming. In spite of the unremitting efforts of the relieving army, which fought battle after battle without stint of labour or loss, the garrison of Kut found themselves, at the beginning of May 1916, left with no alternative but to capitulate. Almost the whole of the garrison were removed into Asia Minor, to a captivity which few were destined to survive. Naturally, the Turks were much elated by this success, following upon their successes in Gallipoli, and were persuaded that the might of the British arm was nothing which they need fear. Leaving a sufficient force to check any further British advance into Mesopotamia, the Turk withdrew the bulk of his forces to operate against the Russians, and perhaps wisely made no great effort to dislodge us from the territory which we already occupied. The opposing forces sat down and watched each other for many months in the entrenched positions below Kut. In March of the following year, 1917, General Maude, on whom had fallen the command of the British Army in Mesopotamia, won a decisive victory at Kut, and pursuing the remnants of the routed enemy, entered Baghdad. The Turks withdrew to the higher country north and northeast of the city, whither they were pursued. After these operations, the British were in occupation of the completed section of the Baghdad Railway, which was then open from Baghdad as far north as Samarra. They also effected a junction with the Russian troops operating in Persia. In the following September, engagements were fought at Ramadi and elsewhere on the Euphrates, with the result that the Turkish garrisons were rounded up, and but few Turkish troops were left to oppose the British forces in Mesopotamia. Nevertheless, an immediate advance was not made up to Mosul and the upper territories of Mesopotamia. Owing to the collapse of Russia, it became necessary for us to take over some of the country in Persia, which had previously been occupied by Russian troops, and an expedition was also sent to assist the Armenians at Baku on the Caspian Sea. Other troops which could be spared from Mesopotamia were sent round in the spring of 1918 to take part in the operations in Palestine, and the forces that remained were devoted to the garrisoning and consolidation of the territory already occupied. A glance at the map of Turkey in Asia will show that the provinces of Mesopotamia and Syria consist of long, narrow strips of fertile country bordered by desert, and resemble two legs which fork at Aleppo. As far as Aleppo, troops and supplies from Europe passed over one common route. From the Turkish point of view, therefore, the campaigns in these two countries were to some extent interdependent. This enabled the Turks to concentrate a reserve at Aleppo, ready to be moved down into either theatre of war, as the exigencies of the situation might demand. Conversely, therefore, a British offensive in Mesopotamia might draw off troops destined for Palestine, or an offensive in Palestine might attract troops otherwise intended for operations in Mesopotamia. There is strong evidence that a Turco-German offensive was contemplated in Mesopotamia for 1918. In the spring of that year, however, a British offensive was undertaken in Palestine, which had the immediate effect of drawing to that country strong Turkish and German reinforcements from Aleppo. Nothing more was heard of the offensive in Mesopotamia, and by the autumn of 1918, there was scarcely a fighting Turk to be found in that country. Just as our expedition against the Dardanelles, by engaging the enemy at a vital spot near home, had materially assisted the defence of Egypt, so did our offensives in Palestine materially assist the defence of Mesopotamia. Turning to another corner of the map of Turkey, where Europe and Asia meet in the mountains of the Caucasus, we see that the Turkish frontier here marches with that of Russia. In the earlier days of the war, the Russians carried out an important and successful advance in this neighbourhood, and early in 1916, occupied the cities of Trebizond and Erzurum. Thus, at the time when the campaign in Palestine was embarked upon, the armies of the Allies were closing in upon eastern Turkey simultaneously from three directions: the Russian Caucasus Army from the northeast, the British Mesopotamian Army from the southeast, and the Egyptian Expeditionary Force from the south. Strategically, the situation seemed full of promise. But, in the winter of 1917-18, followed the disastrous collapse of Russia and the setting free of many Turkish soldiers of good quality from all the Russian fronts for service elsewhere. We had hoped that our offensive in Syria might have been supported by the cooperation of the Russians. Instead, we felt the pinch of their defection in the stiffening of enemy resistance on our front by the transfer of good troops from the Caucasus to Palestine. There is yet another theatre of warfare in Asiatic Turkey, the operations in which exerted considerable influence on those in Palestine. The whole of the eastern shores of the Red Sea formed part of the Ottoman Empire. The southernmost sector, known as the Yemen, was the farthest outpost of that empire. Here a few Turks and Arabs conducted a sporadic warfare against our garrison at Aden, more calculated to cause annoyance and to detain a British force of some strength than to exercise much influence upon the war as a whole. Farther to the north, on this Red Sea littoral, is a province of much more importance, the HEJAZ, in which are situate the most holy of cities in the Muslim world, Mecca and Medina. To Christians, the HEJAZ is forbidden ground. To Mohammedans, it is the focus of pilgrimage from all parts of the world. The Sultan of Turkey, as the ruler of Mecca, is looked up to by the Sunni or Orthodox Mohammedans in all lands as the spiritual head of their church. Though rulers of the HEJAZ, the Turks were not at one with the local population. These are Arabs, and to them the Turkish rule was as unpopular as to most other non-Turkish subjects of that decaying empire. Profiting by Turkey's embarrassments in other parts, the Arabs rose in the summer of 1916, resolved on ridding themselves of the hated Turkish yoke. Sheikh Hussein of Mecca was proclaimed king of the HEJAZ. At this time there were garrisons of Turkish troops stationed at Mecca, Medina, and at the port of Jeddah. Their communication with Turkey was by the recently opened railway to Damascus and Aleppo. This railway, south of Damascus, ran along the high plateau on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, through Man and along the desert to Medina. The intention was to carry the line ultimately through to Mecca, but at this time it was only open for traffic as far as Medina. The revolt broke out on the 5th June 1916, at which date a cordon was spread round Medina. Jeddah was attacked on the 9th, and capitulated after holding out for only a week. The bulk of the Mecca garrison were at this time at Taif. Accordingly, the town of Mecca passed into the hands of the emir, with the exception of the ports. These put up a small fight, but had all surrendered by the middle of July. The force at Taif were blockaded, and on the 23rd September, this force also surrendered. By this time, all the outlying garrisons had been disposed of, and the HEJAZ generally cleared of Turks. Meanwhile, Medina had not only held out, but had been reinforced, and the fighting strength brought up to some 14,000. Late in September, the Turks sallied out and established a cordon of posts at a distance of some 30 to 40 miles from the city. They also pushed further afield, but Arab armies moving up from the south, the Turks withdrew at the end of the year behind the cordon of posts which they had established. For the next 6 months, the railway to the north of Medina was frequently raided by the Arabs, but the town was effectually cut off from its communications with Turkey. In July 1917, Aqaba, at the head of the Gulf of that name, the northeastern arm of the Red Sea, was captured. This is at no great distance from Man, an important depot on the HEJAZ railway, the last outpost of Syria at the edge of the desert of North Arabia. From Aqaba, the railway was now attacked at Man, with serious results to Medina. Nevertheless, that city continued to hold out and was probably never very closely invested. In October and November 1917, about the time of the Third Battle of Gaza, the Turks were still in Man and tried to assume the offensive against the Arabs, but proved too weak to succeed. After the fall of Jerusalem, the Turks withdrew to some extent, and the Arabs advanced towards the lands east of the Dead Sea. From this period forward, the history of the HEJAZ revolt merges in that of the Palestine campaign. The Arab forces east of the Dead Sea afforded a safeguard against any possible Turkish attempt to move round our right flank and raid our line of communications. In February and in March 1918, Turkish expeditions moving against the Arab forces of the King of the HEJAZ, southward from Kerak near the southeastern corner of the Dead Sea, met with failure. The former expedition ended in disaster, and the latter was forced to withdraw, owing to the imminence of a British crossing of the Jordan in its rear. Arab activity on the railway now definitely isolated Medina. Although the Arabs were never strong enough to push a powerful force up through eastern Palestine, yet the presence of a friendly force operating in that country exercised considerable influence upon the later stages of the Palestine campaign. The assistance which the Arabs gave in the ultimate destruction of the Turkish army was invaluable.
This concludes today's reading of With the British Army in the Holy Land, by H. O. Locke. Join us also tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.